If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. Nobody knows where that quote came from or who said it first. Probably was on a bumper sticker to start with. But it seems to encapsulate the mood of the whole world right now. If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. Evidently, most of us are paying attention because the level of outrage in our world is humongous. Everybody and his brother seems to be mad at everybody else these days. If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. And let's be honest, there's plenty to be outraged about. There are so many mass shootings these days, we've almost gotten blasé about them, haven't we? That bunch of thugs who call themselves ISIS has most of the Western world terrorized and fighting among ourselves, which of course is exactly what they want. The city of Chicago is a powder keg just waiting for a spark to ignite it. Nobody feels confident in the economy, and the presidential candidates are already hurling insults at each other and everybody else, and we haven't even cast a single vote. At Duke University, some 2 days after 2 women were sexually assaulted on that campus, hundreds of students gathered and silently streamed across campus. And when they arrived in the front of the chapel building, somebody gave a signal, and all of those students stood there and screamed. They had a scream in. There were no plans adopted. There were no programs outlined for university betterment. They just stood there and screamed in righteous indignation, screamed at the injustice of the world we live in. I think maybe I need to have a scream in every now and then. You think we could get a crowd here for a scream in? Oh, sure we could. There's a lot to be angry about. Now, you could look at passages like today's reading from Isaiah and conclude that, well, we're in good company when we're angry. God gets angry. So we're justified in getting angry too. Isaiah calls on God to tear open the heavens and come down so that the mountains would quake at your presence, to make your name known among your adversaries. Do not be exceedingly angry, O Lord. But you were angry, and we sinned. Do not remember our iniquity forever. Now you might be sitting there saying, Paris, that's an odd passage to choose for this time of the year. But actually, I didn't choose it. This passage is one of the assigned readings on the Common Lectionary for the Advent season. That is, in the run-up to Christmas, we're supposed to read about God getting hopping mad. Maybe that's why most of us want to skip right over most of this stuff and rush straight to the newborn babe cooing in the manger with shepherds on one side and magi on the other and angels hovering above holding a big banner that says Gloria in excelsis Deo in Latin script. Yet here it is in the Bible. You were angry, O Lord, and we sinned. When I studied early American literature in high school, back in the dark ages, our textbook included a sermon by colonial-era Congregationalist pastor Jonathan Edwards. The sermon was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. We studied it not for its theological content, but for its vivid use of imagery. Of course, you couldn't really avoid the theology while you were examining the imagery. Edwards says, the bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready to string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Nice, huh? You see, this is why you get some people who say, well, I prefer the God of the New Testament to the God of the Old Testament. I like the God of love that you find in the New Testament, not the God of wrath and judgment that you find in the Old Testament. Yeah? Well, what do you do with passages like today's text from Mark 13? Jesus says, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. The truth is, folks, you find both God's love and God's wrath throughout the Bible. You can make the case that we are all sinners in the hands of an angry God, or you can make the case that we are all sinners in the hands of a loving God. Maybe that's why passages like these are assigned for the Sundays before Christmas. They remind us that the God who comes to us in Jesus is no more one-dimensional than those of us who are made in God's image. I don't know about you, but I want a God who gets hacked off at the injustice of this world. I want a God who gets angry at the indignities we visit upon each other. I don't want a God who holds Pharaoh's hand and sings Kumbaya while the slaver's whip cracks over the backs of the Israelites. I want a God who thunders to Pharaoh, let my people go. Seminary professor Matt Schlimm tells about one of his students who works at a home where the state sends troubled teenagers after they've been removed from situations of abuse and neglect and drug addiction and a whole Pandora's box of other evils. Well, one boy who had suffered terribly as far back as he could remember listened to Schlimm's student talk about God's love, and the words meant absolutely nothing to him. The boy said, if God is love, then why did all that crap happen to me? So later, the seminary student tried a different approach. He said to him, you know what? God is fiercely angry with the people who hurt you so much. And the young man said, yeah? Tell me more. For the first time, something about Christianity made sense to him. So I don't think we should put on blinders and act as if God never gets angry. God does get angry, ferociously angry. And you know what? God is better at being angry than we are. There are no mixed motives in God's anger. There are no tangled loyalties in God's anger. There's no vindictiveness in God's anger. There's no cruelty in God's anger. There's no self-serving in God's anger. Therefore, you and I can let go of our anger. Because God does it so much better than we do. Like it says in James chapter 1, your anger does not produce God's righteousness. We may be sinners in the hands of an angry God, or we may be sinners in the hands of a loving God, but either way, we're still sinners, right? We still mess things up. We even mess up anger. So let's leave the anger to God, okay? I know there's a lot to be angry about, particularly these days. But believe me, God is angrier about all that stuff than we are. So let your anger go. Pray and work for God's kingdom to come. Pray and work for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. But don't lace it all with anger. Lace it with love and forgiveness. Because God can get plenty angry in our place when necessary. Many of you, I'm sure, remember the story of Corrie ten Boom. Corrie and her sister Betsy and their father joined the Dutch underground during World War II, and they helped Jews escape from the Nazis. Eventually, as happened to so many others, Corrie and her family were betrayed and arrested. Their father soon died at the hands of that brutal regime, and Corrie and Betsy were sent to Ravenswood concentration camp. The horrors they witnessed there and the indignities they suffered there were almost beyond description. They were stripped of their identity, forced into slave labor, brutalized and beaten and starved. And one guard took particular pleasure in making life a nightmare for Corrie and Betsy. Though all the guards were cruel, this man went out of his way to be sadistic to the two sisters and took a fiendish delight in his vicious treatment of them. Before long, Betsy's frail constitution couldn't take the stress anymore, and she died like so many others in those camps. Somehow, Corrie survived the ordeal. After she was released, she went home to pick up the broken pieces of her life. She not only recovered, she found in her faith a rekindled hope for the future. And so after the war, she began to travel around Europe, speaking in churches and lecture halls, to gatherings large and small, talking to people who had suffered as much or more than as she had, but all who wanted to find some way to put the pain of the war behind them. And always her message was the same. The only hope for the future, she would say, was for her listeners to forgive each other for the atrocities of the past. The grace of God, she affirmed, was the only way forward. Well, one Sunday night, she had just finished speaking to a crowd gathered in a church in Bavaria. And the people were filing past her on their way out, shaking her hand. And then she looked down the line and saw a face that made her heart freeze. It was, sure enough, steadily inching his way forward in the line, that same guard from the concentration camp. The pain and the grief and the humiliation he had inflicted on her and Betsy came flooding back, and the thought of taking in her hand, the hand that had meted out such misery, was utterly repugnant to her. Here she had just finished telling a crowd of people they needed to forgive those who had caused them such anguish, and she realized she was incapable of doing it herself. But now he was closer. Now he was just a step or two away. Everything in her wanted to spit on him, knock him to the floor, pummel him senseless. But instead, from some place deep in her soul, she found the strength to pray, "Oh God, from the same great mercy you have extended to me, give me now the mercy to forgive this man who stands before me." And in that moment, she felt an unexpected strength. It moved her arm. It opened her hand. And she looked down and saw her hand shaking the hand of the one who had beaten and mistreated her. Then she looked up into the eyes that had fastened on her with such malice. And she heard herself say, "I forgive you." In the midst of all that makes us angry these days, and all that we have a right to be angry about, don't give in to anger. Love and forgiveness wear much better on a disciple of Jesus.